So I'll start by thanking Annalita for having me. I think I'm the most senior speaker from, I don't know, 25 years ago. When did you start in New York? And Anna made a big shift during the pandemic to being online. I think it's quite impressive what she's been able to do. It's not easy. And it's also very interesting that there are so few international seminars in bioethics like this. In fact, this was the first one. I don't know if there's another one like it. So it's impressive that she is able to do this. I have a very tight hour. I don't even have an hour left, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. I've never been very good at staying to one topic, but every time I've written a book, almost every time, it's been somehow related to bioethics. So I'm going to admit Hannah while I'm talking. So these are some of the books. Mind Wars about brain science and the military, Body Politic about the problems we have in America, a conservative country with a lot of science. And really have those problems right now. Undue Risk, I wrote 25 years ago about, I think it's the first book about the history of human experiments for national security purposes. We had an anthrax attacks after 9/11 in America. Some of you know that. So there was very little written about bioethics and biosafety and biosecurity. So I published In the Wake of Terror. I am notoriously undisciplined about staying on one topic. The current book, which by the way, you don't have to buy, don't go to Amazon and buy it. Go to the Johns Hopkins website for the book. It's open access. It's free. You can download it. So do not pay $45. If you pay $45, I'll probably get a dollar, right? I don't need a dollar. So I much prefer people to
Oh,
read it
wow.
than to spend their money, $45 on the hard copy. If you want to buy the hard copy, someday we'll meet and I'll sign it for $45. I started, this is very hard to explain the background of this book. But Vladimir Putin and President Xi helped me explain why bioethics is relevant to international relations. A few months ago, they had a meeting, as some of you know, and when they were talking about nuclear weapons and showing each other their fancy cars, it turns out they also talked about bioethics. So if you want to read more about Putin and Xi, who are interested in bioethics and interested in life extension, Putin would like to live until the year 2100, as would President Xi. So their would-be successors, I think, need to pay attention to their life extension planning. I don't think that's going to work out, by the way, but they're very interested in what's sometimes called transhumanism, I guess you'd say, in bioethics. So there's a link here between international relations and bioethics, and I wrote this little piece in September after their meeting. Please don't ask me what my next book is because I'm just trying to get over the trauma of writing this book. Every book is traumatizing. I am actually writing another book. It'll be an introduction to bioethics, but that's a story I'll talk about in 2 years, Anna. Uh, when did I start writing the book? That's another common question people have. So I don't credit myself with being really a good predictor, but I think a lot of us felt that something was happening 11 years ago. First with the little green men who somehow appeared in the Donbass. What were those guys doing there, and where were they from? It was an open secret that they were Russians. Nobody really thought they weren't Russians. They weren't little green men from the moon. And then we had the surge in refugees from the global south, particularly from Syria, because Syria had a drought, like Iran has a terrible drought right now. But Syrian refugees went to the north, and that people knew that that was going to create political discontent. Now, I want to say that I don't make predictions, and I want to say I really sympathize with these two people who wrote this piece in 2022. Um, and unfortunately, they did not anticipate what happened in 2024, which is when President Trump was. I say unfortunately because for them, whether it's a bad thing for the world or not, I won't say, but it did happen, and so we don't make predictions, right? We don't predict what's going to happen the next year or two. I do want to say that there's another story here. I'll tell you a few stories before I get to the actual meat of my talk, and then we'll have some time to have some discussion. There's a famous story about Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in 1971 when they had a conversation. Henry Kissinger said to Zhou Enlai, "Well, let's talk about Marxist theory of revolution." And Anna Lita is an expert on Marxism, so she knows all about the Marxist theory of revolution. And Joe said, "That's fine. Let's discuss that." And Henry Kissinger said, "Well, what about the French Revolution? How does the French Revolution fit into your Marxism, Marxist theory of history?" And Zhou Enlai thought for a moment, and he said, "Too soon to tell. Too soon to tell." That's a good story, right?
Yeah.
Because we think of China as they've got the long view, the thousand-year view. Actually, it was a mistranslation. Zhou Enlai thought Henry Kissinger was talking about the students in Paris in 1968 when they shut down the country. So that was the French Revolution that Zhou thought Henry Kissinger was talking about. Still, it's a good story. Look, it's I'm a baseball fan, and some of you know who Yogi Berra was, a great baseball player and baseball coach. And he was famous for his philosophical observations. And so, as coach, baseball player Yogi Berra said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Nonetheless, we can say one thing about the present, which is it is changing very rapidly. I'm not going to read to you all the words on this slide. I'm violating the rules of PowerPoint on this slide. But what I will say is that we have a several hundred-year history of a notion of national sovereignty. And that idea of national sovereignty was first an idea of imperial states. Might makes right. That didn't go so well in the 20th century. We had two world wars, and the old imperial order was replaced after the Second World War by the Allies, led by the U.S., with what they like to call a rules-based order. Instead of might makes right, we have rules, and we know when you're crossing through the rules. Now, that is not to say that America did not benefit greatly from these new rules. The new rules-based order was very good for America. It was also good for much of the rest of the world, but it's very good for the U.S. The U.S. is called by political scientists the global hegemon, the dominant power. That's hegemon is not a word that you generally see used in English, but in political science circles, it means the dominant power. And the U.S. has been the dominant power up till very recently. But that old order is obviously shifting. When I started giving the talk about this book, I was writing this book for the last 3 or 4 years. I had to explain some of the things that you already know. So some of my next slides you don't really need to see, but I'll use them anyway. We can ask ourselves, what happened in the last 10 years? Not everybody agrees what happened, but I think we can say that these things happened. The migration to the global north, with a political reaction in Europe, and particularly in Western Europe. The pandemic was, I think it's fair to say, the response was fumbled. Not necessarily the fault of the World Health Organization, but it did not go well. Then we have the invasion of Ukraine, the notion of illiberal democracies, particularly the model for this illiberal democracy idea is Orban in Hungary. We have rising nationalism, rising protectionism, the re-election of President Trump, and the effect of climate change on asylum policies. These are all some of the things that have, I think, shifted from the rules-based order of post-World War II to the current era. What's also happening is, I think we should take note that that violence in certain places is now, I think, softening our resistance to violence. And we talk about Gaza, we talk about the Ukraine, but I think we need to remember that what's happening in Sudan is also a result of a failure of the rules-based international order. So things have changed quickly. This was the New Atlantic Charter between President Biden and the Prime Minister of the UK 4 years ago, not so long ago. They're articulating, strengthening again the relationship between the US and its European allies. That was just 4.5 years ago. This was what the national security strategy under President Biden said. The rules-based order must remain the foundation for global peace and prosperity. That was then. This is now. Just last week, the Trump administration released a new national security strategy. And I want you to look at this. particularly the lower paragraph. This has not gotten as much comment as it should. Um, this is a prediction that within a few decades, according to the Trump administration, Europe will become non-European. I'm not sure what that means. What does it mean for non-Europeans to be dominating Europe? I'll tell you what I think it means. I think it means that Europe's in trouble the way many Americans thought Europe was in trouble 100 years ago. This was deeply into the movement called eugenics, which if you don't know what the history of eugenics is, that's another talk, Anna. You have to invite me for another occasion. But I think the Trump administration is deeply engaged in ensuring that America stays as white as possible and that Europe stays as white as possible. Now, this is very important to me personally because my father was an immigrant. Well, he was born in Romania, immigrated from Austria in 1925. It was very difficult to come from Austria in 1925. It was very difficult to be Romanian in 1925 and come to the US. And you can see from this old chart that the goal was to have as few people from this part of the world as possible coming to America. We don't want too many Southerners. We don't want too many people from Eastern Europe and South Europe. We want people from Western Europe because they are like us. And that is what's happening right now. It's just happening in the last week. It's very clear what's happening. This is a new slide in my talk, Anna, in honor of the fact that the collapse of the rules-based order from World War II is a return by the U.S. administration, if they can pull it off, to a racist eugenics standard. And I think there's no question about this. Right. But look, Russia's not been happy with the U.S. rule-based order. Putin has been critical for a long time about this. President Xi also not happy with the rules-based order. Many commentators, starting, well, the late 20s, years ago, not happy with the rules-based order. The Wall Street Journal saying what people knew last year, just a year ago, exactly a year ago, the progressive moment in global politics is over. That's a collapse of the rules-based order. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. At the same time, the most, I think, establishment organization in America is the Council on Foreign Relations. Actually, they have branches in other parts of the world as well. And this is not a radical organization. Council on Foreign Relations is a very mainstream organization. And they simply point out in this piece that was published a few years ago that the U.S. has, although it is the global hegemon, the leader of the rules-based order since World War II, has not signed many conventions, not signed many treaties. And there are complicated legal reasons for this in the U.S. Again, looking toward a multipolar world is an unstable world. Oddly enough, only a couple of us on this call can remember the Cold War, when the world was divided between the USSR and the United States. And then there was France somewhere, and then there was the Global South, but we didn't really care about them. But we're now living in a multipolar world. That bipolar world of the Cold War, in some ways, was very stable. Yes, we were afraid about the bomb, but still, it was a kind of stable world in a weird way. The multipolar world is much less stable. So we have the Canadians. We have a very weird relationship with our neighbors to the north right now, recognizing that the world has changed. National security elites like Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State for George W. Bush, recognizing that there is a new world order. Now, what's happening in a way is that the norms are collapsing, the old norms of the rules-based order. I love this story. This is whether it's true or not, it's a good story. In meeting in Potsdam, the big three after World War II, carving up Europe, supposedly at one point, according to then new President Truman's assistant press secretary, Stalin made a remark about Poland. What will we do about Poland after the war? And he said something, and somebody at the table said, well, you know, the Pope really likes Poland. We have to be careful with Poland because the Pope likes Poland. Poland is very Catholic. And supposedly, Stalin said, how many divisions did you say the Pope has? Divisions referring to military strength. Right? That's the old imperial order, worrying about military strength, not interested in the norms of the new rules-based order. I don't know if this is a true story or not, but the assistant press secretary to President Truman said this was the conversation. It's been, what, 15 minutes, and I haven't even gotten to bioethics yet. Finally, we get to bioethics in this bioethics talk. I argue in the book that bioethics is a creature of the rules-based order. I argue this at length. It is a creature and actually an exemplar of the rules-based order. What would it mean for a little field like bioethics if the rules-based order changes? The U.S. has been the global hegemon politically. That's changing now. The U.S. has also been the global hegemon in bioethics. I am betting that in this set of talks, you will hear about the principles of biomedical ethics. And I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment. Those principles are coming from Americans, and they have become the dominant principles of bioethics across the world. Now, I'm also violating another rule of the rule of PowerPoint. You can probably barely see this, but I want to point this out to you. After World War II, the Allies created what they called the Nuremberg Principles. And basically what the Nuremberg Principle says is that if you violate the rules of armed conflict, if you violate humanitarian law, you are responsible. It doesn't matter if you're the leader of a nation or a fighter for the nation, you bear responsibility for violating humanitarian law. That's basically what the Nuremberg Principles say. Now, after a trial of Nazi doctors, the judges built on the Nuremberg Principles to establish something called the Nuremberg Code, which I'm sure some of you know about. The Nuremberg Code was written by the judges of 23 Nazi doctors and medical bureaucrats, and here's a famous image of the 23 defendants in the Nazi doctors' trial. They were on trial for war crimes in the concentration camps and other medically related crimes. 7 of them were hanged. The judges in the trial were so surprised that there were no recognized international rules for doing human experiments that after the trial was over, they decided to write their own rules. And that's called the Nuremberg Code. Now, the first sentence of the Nuremberg Code is the voluntary consent of the human subject. And you talk about, if you're in bioethics, you talk about consent all the time, right? Consent in the doctor-patient relationship. What I was interested in the book is, what did they mean by absolutely essential? That's the title of the book. So what I think the judges of those Nazi doctors meant by the words absolutely essential was 2 things. First, essential for ethical research with human beings, but also essential for the management of the life sciences in the new rules-based international order. In other words, the trial of the Nazi doctors became part of an effort by the victorious Allies to bring medical science within the structure of the new rules-based order that would succeed the old imperial order. I'm letting Hannah into the room. So that's the argument of the book. A few years later, as many of you know, the World Medical Association decided to have its own code of ethics. It's different. It's not the same as the Nuremberg Code. The World Medical Association had as its goal bringing medical ethics back under the authority of doctors, not judges and lawyers, but doctors. And so it gives much more flexibility to medical investigators, medical experimenters, than the Nuremberg Code did. Well, gradually, and I explain this in the book, you can see the way that the consent doctrine came out of human experiments into regular medical care, regular medical practice. It's quite interesting how this happened. It took 20 years, 30 years for this to happen, but it did happen. So now consent is required in regular medical practice, not only if you're doing a human experiment. Now, I want to do a little, I'm going to give you a quiz on I think you know the answer to this question, but I'm going to give you a quiz. So in 1956, this book was published called Medical Ethics. It came from Loyola University in Chicago, where there is a very fine medical school. And this medical ethics textbook, if you were a medical student in 1956, Um, you might have actually walked into a library and walked into shelves of books. We don't do that anymore. Who goes to libraries anymore? We just go on our screen and get into the library electronically. But maybe, in 1956, you would have done what I did. Anna's not old enough to do this, but have done this. But I did go to the library and I went up to the books. And sometimes I took a book off the shelf. And if I was a medical student in 1956, I might have selected this book if I was curious about medical ethics. So here's a case. And I want you to tell me what you think about the answer that the Professor Healy, gave in his textbook. Chondrosarcoma is basically a bone cancer. So in this case, Miss A has chondrosarcoma. Tell me, she pleads with Dr. B, do I really have a cancer? Dr. B, knowing that Miss A has ample time to prepare for death and wishing to spare her needless mental suffering, answers, your pains are due to arthritis. All right, now who wants to tell me whether they agree with this answer or not? Does anybody want to be brave and volunteer? Is this the answer that you would give in 2025 if you were given this quiz?
No.
Charlotte, brave. What are you saying? Go.
I think she has the right to know what disease she has.
Okay. Who else? Who else wants to tell me the answer? You don't agree. Who else? Does anybody agree? Charlotte, what do you think?
I think I agree that I don't agree with what the doctor said. I feel like um he has no idea if she does have ample time or if getting arthritis will fix her mental suffering. So I feel like consent
Okay.
is the
That's a
answer.
perfectly reasonable answer, but I'm afraid, according to Professor Healy, you're wrong. But I'll tell you why you're wrong in a moment. First, I'm going to tell you why I found this case so interesting. This is my mother and me in 1955. You'll be happy to know that after this picture was taken, they were able to afford to buy me a shirt. My mother died in 2016. I don't remember my mother this way in a sundress because about a year and a half, 2 years after this picture was taken, my mother was diagnosed with a chondrosarcoma, just like Miss A in that case. Her chondrosarcoma was diagnosed when she was 39. It was here. If you any, we have some physicians in the group, and I'm admitting isokin. And it was a lump in her right shoulder, behind her right shoulder, and her right arm was amputated at the clavicle when she was 40, January 1958. So I don't remember her ever wearing a sundress. So you can see why this case really interested me. Now, back to the case, and I'll explain to you why you were wrong. Um, this is what the doctor was right in saying what he said. According to Professor Healy, if she has really arthritis, or if he believes that everybody her age does have at least a mild case of arthritis, his answer is not morally wrong. I'm sure you're surprised by Professor Healy's answer because that was 1956, but this is why you got it wrong. If she really wanted to know that she had cancer, she would have said, are all my pains due to arthritis? You see, this is the problem with patients. They didn't go to law school. They didn't go to philosophy school the way Anna and I did. And so they don't know how to ask a question. Now, that should surprise you. I'm sure it does. Things have changed. But we know that that was not unusual. Professor Healy's answer was not unusual. There was a famous study, a survey of doctors in 1961, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the vast majority of them said they would not tell their patients they had cancer. Interesting. So it's not just the case. It's not just the textbook. It seems to be the answer to the survey and actual practice in 1961. 18 years later, another group did the same survey, and they got exactly the opposite answer. Within 18 years, medical ethics had changed, and the consent standard that I was talking about a few minutes ago became dominant. Now, the view was that doctors were supposed to tell the truth to their patients. That's a big change. That's a historic change. Now, just to note, this is a survey. Did they really behave this way? Did they really tell their patients the truth? We can't say. We weren't in the room. But what this tells us is that doctors knew by 1979 that the rules had changed. They knew what the right answer was. There was a different answer from 1956 or 1961. So the consent standard had really taken hold. And I believe the consent standard is part of the new rules-based international order. Now, I said was going to mention the principles. I'll bet many of you in this group know about the work of Tom Beecham and Jim Childress, good friends of mine, colleagues of mine. Professor Childress just passed away a few months ago. This is the dominant textbook in medical ethics. And these are the principles that you may be familiar with. Respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, in other words, do no harm, the Hippocratic principle. Beneficence, try to do good, a Kantian principle, and then justice. Well, choose, maybe it's John Rawls who's behind the principle of justice, the Harvard professor of political philosophy. These four principles are really important in medical education because, as I say here, they could fit in a 3x5 card. I know many of you are too young to remember what 3x5 cards look like, but they can also fit, as in this case, on a screen. So that really helped doctors think about the ethics of their practice. Here they have the principles. Now they have to figure out how to weigh and balance the principles against each other. But I want to say this. What if instead of personal autonomy being the first principle in that list, what if justice was the first principle? And I'm actually thinking about this while I'm writing a textbook in bioethics with a former postdoctoral fellow who's now a professor at the University of Massachusetts. We are rethinking this question. We're doing this thought experiment. What if the analysis of bioethics changed so that the first principle was justice? Would that change the way that we approach bioethics in the world after the pandemic? And I believe that the world after the pandemic is a different world. And it's a world that challenges new ways of thinking about bioethics. Now, part of what has happened, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years, because US bioethics, American bioethics, has been so dominant, is that we've forgotten that there are other bioethics principles. So, for example, when the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee surveyed people in 2004, they came up with a number of different principles. I'm just showing you this quickly so you get the idea. There are other principles that are not necessarily developed by American bioethicists. There's also something very interesting happening right now in the case of Russia. When the invasion of Ukraine took place, within weeks, clinical trials in Russia stopped. The international pharmaceutical community actually stopped doing clinical trials, or at least they didn't start any new trials. That has never happened before. It has never happened before that the international pharmaceutical industry took a position like this. Now, there were a number of reasons, not only because they were trying to make a political statement, I think they weren't, but it was very difficult to get, because of sanctions, to get medicines into Russia. So there were no new clinical trials in Russia. There are a few continuing trials, but hardly any new ones. And I've written about this, so I won't get into the details here. But it's notable that the Nuremberg Code that I showed you from 1947, according to a Russian scholar, was not translated into Russian until 1986. I think that is very suggestive about the culture of bioethics in Russia. And I think we have some really interesting questions now about bioethics after the war in Ukraine in Russia. So Russian science has to some extent isolated itself from the rest of the world. During the Cold War, Russians and Americans went back and forth as scientists. I visited Moscow twice with my parents. My father was a psychiatrist. Went to conferences, gave lectures. He lectured in 1959 in Moscow. I went with him. He lectured in 1966 in Moscow. I went with him. In 1959, we visited the mausoleum where we saw Lenin and Stalin lying next to each other. When we went back in 1966, Stalin was gone. They had taken Stalin out, and it was only Lenin. And Lenin is still there in the mausoleum. Whether it's really Lenin or not, it could be like, Madame Tussauds, but we don't know. It could be a wax dummy. But anyway, what appears to be Lenin is still there. In that time, during the Cold War, American and Russian scientists went back and forth. Russian scientists won Nobel Prizes and other international awards during the Cold War. Russian science is isolated now as never before. And also, they are not paying to send their scientists to the West to attend conferences. That is something different. That is something new. My friend, Professor Natalia Shok, a Russian bioethicist and political scientist, has written some very interesting stuff about the way that Russian foreign policy and Russian medical science are aligned with each other. So global health policy, as she points out, is aligned in Russia with their broader foreign policy strategy. I think this is quite interesting, and it's something worth noting. We spent a lot of time talking about China and science. And in the book, if you read it, you'll see I talk about China and science in relation to the US and the West. We don't, I think, really focus on what's happening with science in Russia, which is, again, an indication of the collapsing rules-based order. So these are the big questions I want to ask in the book, and I think they're questions for all students of bioethics now. Do we need new ways of analyzing bioethics issues after the collapsing rules-based order and after the pandemic? What is the common morality now in the world? Where are norms in the world? Do we need a principle of reciprocity? Reciprocity does not appear in Principles of Biomedical Ethics in the Beecham and Childress textbook. What is the role of reciprocity? How can we understand public health now? I think we need a new way of thinking about public health, than a different way than we did before the pandemic. I'm bidding Hannah again, just so you know, Anna. Has the bioethics community paid close enough attention to dual use, biosafety, and biosecurity? During the pandemic, with colleagues in Europe, I wrote about bioethics nationalism or vaccine nationalism. It's a very interesting thing. Nobody, I think, in bioethics has really pointed out, other than a few of us, that where you were, what country you were in during the pandemic, determined what vaccines you received. That was not something that people in bioethics really thought about before the pandemic. It depends on what country you're in. If you're in Argentina or Peru, in Chile, in Hungary, in Romania, in the US, in Russia or China, where you were was determined by the arrangements that your governments made to get particular vaccines. So I want to tell you one story that I love, that my friend and colleague in Hungary, Professor Sándor, told me in 2021. In the spring of 2021, in Budapest, if you were a pregnant woman and you went to your obstetrician for your obstetric care, you would be asked if you had been vaccinated for COVID. And if you said no, then you would be offered Moderna, one of the Western vaccines. That's telling me that I need to stop talking soon. If you were the man who accompanied the pregnant woman in Budapest, you were also offered a vaccine. Which one, do you think, according to Professor Sándor? Sputnik V. You would be offered the Russian vaccine. Why the Russian vaccine, and why was the woman getting the Moderna vaccine? Well, the Moderna vaccine was highly reliable. The Russian vaccine, we're not so sure. But we are a pro-natalist society. Hungary is pro-natalist. We want babies. Orban really wants babies. He wants more babies, more Hungarian babies. We want to protect those ladies. We want to make sure they have their babies. The guy, he's already done his thing. We don't care. Maybe he's not even the father. Who knows? So we'll give him Sputnik V. I'm not making that up. You can write to Professor Sándor and ask her if that's true. So now we have to talk for just a moment about the global pharmaceutical industry. the rules-based order has been very good for global pharmaceuticals. We have a global system of testing drugs, of distributing drugs. We did anyway. What happens in global pharma if the rules-based order is diminished? What happens if it changes? We have an idea since World War II of global human equality. That means that if I ask you, if you're in Florida or Bucharest or Lima, wherever you are, if I ask you to be in my clinical trial, if I'm an experimenter, and you don't want to be in my clinical trial, I'm a philosopher, so you definitely don't want to be in my clinical trial, but imagine that I'm a qualified investigator. If I said to you, Annalita, would you be in my clinical trial? Annalita has the right to two things anywhere in the world. She has the right to have the proposal, my protocol, my experimental protocol, reviewed by a committee we call a research ethics board or an institutional review board. That's one thing she's entitled to. That committee must not have conflicts. It must be an expert committee. It looks at the proposal. Is the science reasonable? Is it evidence-based? What about the informed consent form that we ask Annalita to sign? Is it an adequate form? All that, anywhere. The other thing that Annalita would be entitled to, if I'm asking her to be in my experiment, is informed consent. Now, that's true anywhere in the world. Those two requirements are based on an idea of universal human equality. That everybody has merit anywhere in the world. That is not, as they say about the Ten Commandments, written in stone. That is a decision that was made by the global community after World War II, that there is such a thing as global human equality. And in human experiments, that means that everybody is entitled to be treated the same way. So we'll see if that continues. Really interesting things are happening in meetings now, and this is not only this writer in the Guardian a few months ago. People who were in the Biden administration that I know are saying the same thing. The U.S. is just not going to international meetings. The U.S. has already engaged in a kind of isolationism, not just about science, but I mean in just about everything. They're not going to meetings. China is going to meetings. So if there's a new order, it might well be a China-dominated order. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a quote from the Italian communist, which you will never hear in any other talk in bioethics, I'm sure, a quotation from an Italian communist in the 1930s. I don't know how many of you have actually read Antonio Gramsci. Hardly anybody reads Gramsci unless you're Annalita, who is educated in Marxist philosophy. Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini because Gramsci was a real communist. Gramsci started out as a communist and became a fascist, complicated. And Gramsci was very annoying to Mussolini, so Mussolini imprisoned him. And Gramsci made notes in the prison, and this is one of his remarks that he died in prison, or he died just after he was released from prison, so he could die outside of prison. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. I believe this is absolutely on point for the world we are in, not only in bioethics, but for the international system. The bioethics is only a part of the international system. We are in an interregnum, and we can't know at the moment where this is going or what the new order will look like. So something to think about from my friend Judith Sándor, the Hungarian that I just mentioned. I think what people in bioethics need to think about is getting closer to the idea of human rights. The human rights movement and the bioethics movement have been kind of on parallel tracks for decades. I think we're now forced to think more carefully and perhaps to align ourselves more with human rights movements. Implicitly, bioethics, I think, has been a human rights movement. But I think we need to make that a little more explicit going forward. And you'll see that I write about that also in the book, which again, the book, free of charge. You can pay Amazon $45 for, or you can just go to the MIT Press website for the book and download it. And with that, I will stop and appreciate any comments or questions.
Jonathan, one question. Can we download it and post it on our website? No.
I don't know how you would do that.
They
But
wouldn't allow us.
you can post the link.
The
You
link.
can post the link. Yeah. It's open access.
Great.
I'm not making any money on this book.
Yeah, great book.
Don't make much money on other ones either, but definitely not on this one. But you're welcome to buy it for
Thank you.
$45 if you like. And
Yeah.
when I meet you, I can actually sign it. So
I'm Nadia from Morocco. I have a question.
Yes.
You talk a lot about the cancer. You give us the case about the physician if he has to tell the truth to the patient. I have a question for you. If it's not the cancer, if it's another disease, like for example, VIH or SIDA or for example, mental disorder, the diseases that we call them shame diseases. Do you
Shame
think
diseases.
that the patient has the right to know? And
Right.
how to protect the patients from the entourage, because if the family or the work we know, it will be a great problem for the patients.
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that I do address a little bit in the book. So, look, there are cultural differences in the way in which the principles of bioethics are interpreted. We have certainly learned that in the U.S. There are groups in the U.S., ethnic groups, new immigrant groups in the U.S. that do not appreciate the truth. In fact, they would rather not to know, not to be fully informed. And I think that is a real problem in a pluralistic culture, a pluralistic society like ours. I will say that I am not going to tell you how to practice medicine in Morocco. And I'm not going to tell you how you should apply the rules. But what I think this shows us is that everybody in bioethics needs to admit that those rules don't necessarily apply the same way everywhere. Now, in the case of a patient who you think would be hurt by knowing the truth, would be shamed, as you say, if you have a shame culture, I think you still have to ask yourself, who makes the decisions for this person? Do we need to find a surrogate who has their best interests in mind? So that, because it does seem to me that there is a conflict of interest for the doctor to make all those medical decisions for the patient. It does seem to me you need to bring someone else into the conversation. So that's what I would say to you, right? Look, somebody who does not have the ability to fully participate in the informed consent conversation is nevertheless entitled to be respected. So the question I would put to you is, how in your culture can you express respect for them without involving them directly in the conversation about what is the best care for them? I think that's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a hard question.
May I, Professor Moreno, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I have many comments and ideas in my mind now coming, but concerning this issue of informing patients about their life-threatening condition, I'd like to comment also and answer what you have already done to the colleague from Morocco. In Moldova, about 10 years ago, we also conducted a survey among patients in the oncological hospital. And the data showed that 75% of the patients were not informed about the condition. So they suspected something, but it has never been actually
Told to
spoken
them.
or informed, right? And this is a culturally embedded issue because in Moldova, the old school, medical school, were teaching, as in 61, in your cases in the States, also in the 80s, 90s, nobody would teach future doctors that there is such an issue as informed consent, or there is informing patients. It's about respecting them as a person. So only later we introduced this courses of bioethics, and everything went on. But later we also, after this research, we introduced at the university with a team of about 15 scholars and teachers. We went to a course of palliative care, and so we established a variety of courses about how to talk to the patients, because in the same parallel research conducted to the doctors, when we asking them why they don't inform them. So to present their positions on that. So they say, first of all, they, on the one hand, older physicians said that nobody actually told, this is their practice, this is about the culture. Those who are middle-aged or younger said, they did feel that it's something wrong, and they know about the legislation, they know about these things, but they don't know how to do that. So this is a very complicated issue also for the physician. So it's about the communication. So later we introduced and we enlarged these courses of communication for the physician, and we teach them these protocols, spikes protocol, and many others that would be helpful for them to communicate to the patients. But still, the situation is not the one as it is expected to be according to the, let's say, international standards, because it's about culture. It takes time, and it's about how, even if a patient, it is also very particular, because some patients don't even want to know about their condition. They prefer to be told maybe about their perspective, how much time they have or what they have to do, but they don't want to know. And in our culture, indeed, providing this bad news, it's something bad both for the physician, but both for the, and nobody wants to assume this
Nobody wants to
role
give bad news.
right. So this is one of the main core in this issue, but it's about education, it's about culture, and it's about all our responsibility to find the right key for each society, how to make this on the one hand respect human rights, but also to make our activity more efficient and to really help the people that need our support. So
So
that
you
was
sent several very important things. First, people find out anyway. People have a way of finding out. A nurse slips and says something that they weren't supposed to say. A relative says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you have cancer." People find out, right? Secondly, yes, I agree with you entirely. It's a matter of physicians don't necessarily know how to communicate bad news. And so, yes, this is partly a matter of education. I'm going to make also a big historical assertion. As medicine is more scientific, as it has more power, people want to participate more. I think over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, medicine has become more science-based. As it becomes more science-based, it's not just about the authority of the doctor, right? It's also about knowledge. And I as a patient, I'm not a physician. I as a patient, I want to have some of the knowledge that you have, doctor. So there's a kind of a power relationship here. Who gets to have the knowledge about my body? And so there's a big social movement here, I think, in the direction of more equality with respect to the knowledge about what's going on with my body. But I agree that, of course, people aren't comfortable. I don't like to give bad news. And nobody likes to give bad news. There's have to be something wrong with you if you like to give bad news, right? And yet you want the patient to trust you rather than finding out from somebody else. And then the patient might think, well, how can I trust my doctor if my doctor didn't even tell me this news? All right, but all very good points. Thank you for that. I think we have a hand, and go
Yes,
ahead.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Moreno. My name is Isoken. I'm calling from Nigeria. So I have a comment on the chat box already,
Yeah.
trying to say that, okay, um, I could appreciate the great analysis you did, and it's a world of information. And then many times for us to be able to make this kind of critical analysis of what you have done and be able to come to certain conclusions or even raise the necessary ethical questions, we need to really understand what's happening there in the world.
Yeah.
Again, I want to make a comment. I understand that during COVID-19, not many Africans really got access to this the vaccine, particularly in Nigeria. So what happened was that many people went back to their indigenous healing methods. So we found out that many people took this, and one way or the other, they could not really explain what actually happened, but they did not catch the disease. And I'm saying this in asking you, how do you think this changed the narrative about vaccine and healing, especially in the light of the theme that you just mentioned about science-based information
Yes.
and knowledge? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the fact that even if people do have access to what we'll call scientific medicine, they very often they continue to be treated by should we call it, a folk practitioner, right, or a traditional medical practitioner. I understand that is the case. And it happens even in places like New York City. I used to work in New York City in a hospital in medical ethics, and there the family doctors had to be aware of the traditional healers and their practices, what they were providing to their patients, so that what they're giving to their patients doesn't conflict with the medication, right, or whatever they're getting from the folk practitioners. Obviously, if you don't have access to, what shall we call it, medical science, you will go to your folk practitioner, of course. I mean, it's totally understandable if you don't have access. That's a failure of our system to be fully integrated and global. And I mean, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know how we fix that. We certainly don't fix it by undermining the World Health Organization, which is unfortunately what's happening in the U.S. administration right now. We have to think more carefully about how we get medication to people in parts of the world where it's not so easy to disseminate. So you and I can talk more about this offline. You have a lot more to teach me about what's going on in Nigeria than I can tell you. But I recognize that, what you're describing is just a failure of our system. I think we have time for another comment or question. Anna, I'm leaving it up to you.
Okay, yeah, you can go ahead if they have more questions. But Jonathan, I don't want you to leave before we take a couple of group photos.
Okay. Well, I can answer while you're taking the pictures if somebody wants to ask a question.
Yeah, that's Mihaela.
Mihaela, did you have your hand? Who had their? Mihaela had her hand up, I think. And I think you're on mute.
We can't hear you. Mihaela, you're muted.
While Mihaela is doing that, is there another question?
That's it. Okay, go ahead with the other one. So I'm going to call her. I think she...
Or comment.
She didn't
Doesn't have
realize
to be a
that.
question. Could be a comment.
She didn't realize that, Mihaela. Why she
Anybody?
I think Pascal had a comment or a question in the
Right.
chat box.
Thank you, Pascal. People can see it.
Would you like me
Right.
to read it?
Yeah, why don't you read it, Charlotte?
When ethics of principles that seem to reflect Western individualism conflicts with communalist cultures where identification with dependence on communal values enhance autonomy, which ethics will prevail? Consider such situations where widows are subject to community values and procreate despite the demise of the husband. Do such practice reflect induced consent or voluntary consent?
Well, without getting into the procreation part of it, I mean, the more general question is, to what extent can women make their own decisions about their health care? And the truth is that globally this varies, but I talk about this a little bit in the book. We would like to think that bioethics is global, that all the values are the same, that the Western value of female equality is the same everywhere, but it's not. The truth is, it's not the same everywhere, right? So we have to come to terms with the fact that there are cultures that don't accept the idea that women can make their own medical decisions, whether it's about reproduction or something else. And that is not I think we have not fully come to terms with that in bioethics. We have liked to think that, ultimately, if you explain things to people, that they will all follow the same rules, but that is not necessarily true. But that puts us in a dilemma, right? So then how do we implement medical care? How do we implement human experiments where it might be the head man of the village rather than the woman who decides whether the woman is in the clinical trial or whether the woman gets a certain kind of treatment? This is something we have to face in global bioethics, and people in global bioethics have tried to think, all these Western values will finally prevail, and we can presume that they're the case. We cannot presume they're the case. I mean, in her way, Nadia brought this up. Pascal's brought this up. This is a conversation we absolutely have to have in bioethics. I think we have not been honest enough or straightforward enough about the role of human rights in bioethics, and that bioethics must embrace strongly, affirmatively, the rights of women to make their own medical decisions, even in traditional cultures. And we have not really, I think, embraced that fully in bioethics. We have liked to think that that was the case. And I'm not here to tell people in other societies how to function, right? But I think in bioethics, we need to come to terms with this. It's still kind of a dilemma that we really haven't resolved. Anna, are we done?
Just a sec. I think Kalina Kamenova is following, but she's nice. So she was waiting. I don't know why she didn't realize that she could come to your meeting and be there, So I told her right now.
Okay, well, Mihaela, do you want to join me?
Exactly. Let's listen to Mihaela.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Thank you very much for so many interesting things. I have a general question. After this global pandemic, do you think that to the next one, whenever it will happen, how do you have a list of advices? The specialists. There were so many mistakes they did vaccinating all the people. Are they such rules? Did you produce such a list of good behavior to, let's say, to analyze the situation of each person which has to be vaccinated?
So, this is the challenge, I think, going forward. I think the ethics of public health has not been well developed in bioethics. Bioethics has concentrated in the last 80 years on the individual encounter between the doctor and the patient, or between the medical investigator and the potential participant in a clinical trial. That one-to-one relationship. We have not thought systematically about public health ethics. We have not made that a priority. That's why I say if we start with the principle of justice first, it changes the analysis. Rather than thinking about respect for persons. We don't lose respect for persons, but we have to think more clearly about a framework for ethics in public health. I published a paper 20 plus years ago as part of a group, a framework of public health ethics. It's one of my most downloaded papers. I don't like that paper particularly. We have a lot of principles. The more principles you have, the less effective those principles are. We need to think more systematically about a public health framework for bioethics. That's the first thing I would say. Second thing is we need institutions, Michaela. We need the World Health Organization. We need Gavi, right? We can't lose those. If we don't have those institutions, we will have to recreate those institutions. So I'm very worried about the withdrawal of the U.S. from WHO. I hope it doesn't happen. It's foolish, terrible mistake for our country. But it's two things, right? We have to, in bioethics, we have to think about a framework for global public health, which we have not. And you're inviting me to tell you what the lessons would be. I don't know what they would be yet. We have to think about them. And we have to have the institutions. So this is what I can say. It's not enough, but we have to start.
Can I ask something?
Everybody. Oh, okay.
Can I ask something?
Linda.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really so informative. Talking about global ethics, how do you see what happened in Gaza? All these double standards, injustice. How do you see it as someone talking about bioethics and medical ethics in general?
I mean, I not only in Gaza, I think we have already in Syria, in Aleppo, for example. I followed events in Aleppo a few years ago. We've lost the concept of medical neutrality. That's what really worries me.
Yes.
The notion of medical neutrality, that medical care, medical personnel have to be respected in the war zone. That is an idea that I think is really, really damaged in a number of places. But as I said to you, I was worried about this in Syria when the al-Assad government was in Aleppo, was kidnapping doctors and nurses and leaving their bodies on the side of the road. It's very frustrating. So
Yeah.
I asked my friend who was the director of Physicians for Human Rights a few years ago, don't you get really frustrated in doing this kind of work? And he said, absolutely. It's all about frustration. But you have to keep doing it. You have to keep doing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.